Welcome to RISE Learning Machines seminars. RISE is Sweden's public research institute, and this is our weekly seminar on AI and machine learning. This meeting will be recorded, and let us know if you want to be removed from this. Also, do check out the collection of great talks that we have on our YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Alexander Mathis, who is assistant professor at EPFL. Alexander defended his PhD at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. He works on the intersection of computational neuroscience and machine learning. He works on animal behavior, adaptive sensorimotor control, and he's the author behind the famous DeepLabCut system. The topic today will be measuring behavior and modeling the brain with machine learning. And with this said, I will hand over the word and the screen sharing to you, Alexander.
Thank you. So let me share the screen. Can you see it?
Not yet. Now we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Great. So it's a great pleasure to talk to you. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. I was actually fortunate to visit this seminar myself and attend it in Lund in last September. And today the plan was to talk about 3 different research directions that we pursue in the lab. The first one is how we carry out research on measuring animal behavior. Then I will talk about how we also use that kind of research to model the sensory-motor system. And then finally, I will talk about skill learning with reinforcement learning. And in particular, we will focus there also on musculoskeletal systems. So for the goal of reverse engineering motor control. So let me start. As you all are aware of, animals, or the animal kingdom is highly diverse, and there are many different animals that have very different body plans. And if we focus on a particular animal, let's say the cheetah, it's of course relatively easy with modern technology to capture its behavior. You can just buy a fancy camera, and if you are a courageful individual, you can get close to these creatures and film them. Now, if you film animal behavior, you're capturing the behavior, but you're actually capturing it in a very high dimensional way, because videos, especially slow motion videos, consist of many frames and many pixels in X and Y. And that's maybe not the best way to represent animal behavior. And I'm of course not the first person, and I think a Swedish person made that point very strongly, called Gunnar Johansson. So here's a famous video from him. And what you can see here is actually a very low dimensional video. So there are a few points moving across the screen, but because these few points are moving in a spatio-temporally coherent way, it is very easy for your visual system to recognize that these are humans that walk towards each other, shake their hand, and what their behavior is. And so the bottom line from this is that pose estimation, i.e. estimating the sum of the relevant key points of an animal or of a human here, and doing this low dimensional transformation is a really good way to capture and summarize behavior. And of course, many people have realized this for a long time. And for that reason, a lot of people work on pose estimation. Historically, pose estimation was tackled in a marker-based fashion, just because from a computer vision point of view, doing it in a markerless version, as you will see in a second, turned out to be a really, really difficult problem. And the way marker-based pose estimation essentially works is you attach very visible cues or markers to the animal or the subject under study. And that, because this is a very salient features in the scene, then the computer vision problem of localizing these markers is actually turns out to be very easy. And as you can imagine, there has been quite a revolution for marker-based or marker-less pose estimation, and in particular in the human pose estimation field. So what you can see here is a video of a bunch of people dancing, and overlaid is the estimated posture of all these individuals. And it's from an algorithm called OpenPose that was published in 2017. But of course, this is extremely active field of research. The first deep learning methods for human pose estimation were done in 2014. And I think if you just go to Google Scholar and look at how many papers are there in deep learning and human pose estimation, there are more than 60,000. So what's kind of the advance here? The advance with especially in 2017 was that these models worked really well out of the box. And like previous algorithms, the way such a pose estimation algorithm works is you feed it in some images, and then the predictor predicts the pose, so the x and y coordinates of semantically defined key points. And with deep learning, what essentially happened is this predictor turned out to be a deep neural network, and it was actually trained on lots of labeled images of humans and their markers, their key points, where people had clicked on a lot of images, and then you train the system, and it actually generalizes quite nicely. So now these algorithms have a number of interesting, appealing properties, I would say. They work in the wild, as it said in computer vision, so you can use them outside of the laboratory. They're very robust to the backgrounds, number of individuals. On GPUs, you can run them very fast. And one thing that was, of course, really interesting for us studying animals and thinking back to this argument that I made earlier, that there are actually many different animals with many different body plans, is that there's actually no body model required in these algorithms, unlike with previous state-of-the-art methodologies. And so in that sense, in principle, one could make models for mice and cats and anything you like. Of course, the question is, do you need to label thousands of images in order to actually make that happen? So just to summarize kind of this introduction, the task of pose estimation is going from a very high-level pixel representation to a very low-level key point representation. And as I was motivating with Gunnar Johansson's work, that is a very good representation that is useful for many downstream tasks like linking behavior to kinematics, to the neural codes, using it for action segmentation, linking it to biomechanics. I will talk about some of those things actually in the later part of the talk. So now, I hope you all agree that pose estimation is an interesting task. And I think from the work that I showed you so far, it was actually clear that this will also work on animals. I mean, there's nothing special about mice, let's say, in contrast to humans. What the surprising thing with DeepLabCut actually was that was how little data you actually required. So let's say you study mice and you study how mice reach for a joystick. So these are some shots of a mouse and the hand of a mouse. And what we did is we annotated a bunch of frames with, let's say, some of the key points of its digits. And based on those frames, we trained DeepLabCut, which really at that time is essentially a ResNet that is pre-trained on ImageNet. That part is important because if you try to train it from scratch, you will need many, many more labeled images that I will show than what I will show you in a second. And then at the end, there's basically a task-specific component where we have deconvolution layers that upsample the feature representation from the ResNet. And then pose estimation is actually formulated here like an image-to-image translation problem. So when we have these ground truth labels, what the model is actually supposed to do is, for a particular image, it's supposed to predict a probability density of where this key point is in an output map, let's say, in an output map. And so in that sense, it's actually an image-to-image translation problem. And in DeepLabCut, we train the whole architecture end to end. Of course, these weights here at the end, they're initially randomly initialized. Everything else is initialized from ImageNet pre-training. And I think the exciting thing about DeepLabCut was that you could actually get away with really few labeled frames. So if you labeled, for example, if you label 140 frames and you run this algorithm on a different mouse in the same setup doing the same task, it actually generalized really well. And again, because there's no body model here, you can, of course, then use the same procedure on many, many different settings, as I will show you in a second. This was for one example of mice reaching. Here's another example that in neuroscience, let's say, is very popular, where we film mice from above, and it's often called an open field paradigm, but they're not in the field. It's really a mouse in a box. And let's say you want to track these 4 key points on the mouse. What we show in this plot is how many training images you need to reach good performance on some test images. And what you can see is that, or I should say, what we also did is we estimated how accurately a human can actually do the task that is very motivated. And we found that for the best of us on the paper, he could do this with 2.7 pixel accuracy, which here is a scale above 10 pixels. This guy is really good at finding the same points over more than a month apart. And so what we see in this plot is that DeepLabCut can actually reach the same variability as Pranav if you train it with just around 800 frames. So that's great. That means you can build a system that can analyze the data as well as you can do it with your excellent primate visual system. But what is also interesting is really if you give the system way fewer annotated images, then it actually rather gracefully degrades in performance. And even if you just give it 50, you get actually a system that on average predicts the key points with just 5 pixel errors. So that's, so bottom line here is because of transfer learning, you can actually get away with relatively little annotation data. Okay. So now, of course, overall in the lab, we're not just interested in studying mice in the lab, but studying animals in general. And this is a figure that we wrote with many others in the field of ecology, and that kind of depicts maybe our vision and our dream. And the dream is really to be able to first tell from pictures of animals who they are, like individually identify them, then be able to kind of assess their posture, localize them in the picture, assess their behavior, also their behaviors in relation to each other and the behaviors in relation to the environment. We, in the lab, work on all these different problems. Today, I will actually, from now on, I will talk very briefly about re-identification, how we do that part. And I will then talk a bit more about state-of-the-art pose estimation algorithms for multiple individuals. And also very briefly about behavior. And then I switch gears and go to the sensorimotor side. So one way that we have tackled the identification of individuals is we actually use the same backbone that we use for pose estimation. And then on that backbone, we formulate the problem as re-identification of individuals as a multitask problem, where this neural network doesn't just need to solve, well, let's say, localizing all the body parts and identifying how they are connected, but it also is supposed to solve the identity of individuals. Sorry, and here in this specific case, it's done for marmosets that are marked, okay? But you could do the same procedure, let's say, on zebras, which are marked by nature because they have very specific patterns on their fur. And so here is a quantification from our Nature Methods paper from 2 years ago, where we showed that the algorithm can actually identify which one of these, well, which monkey it is, based on just the visual features in a single frame with more than 95% accuracy. Yeah. So next, I want to talk briefly about multi-animal or multi-individual pose estimation. And there are really 2 paradigms that people use. The first paradigm is called the so-called top-down approach. So there, the idea is you have a picture with multiple individuals, and you first use an object detector to localize the individuals. So what an object detector gives you is bounding boxes around the individuals. And then you can use those bounding boxes to crop the individuals. And you have a second neural network, the pose estimator, that will then predict the poses of the individuals. Obviously, in this example that I'm showing you here, this pipeline is failing. And the reason why this pipeline is failing is that when people are extremely close, then the bounding boxes will obviously contain more than just one person in it. And so the task of pose estimation for the second model becomes actually ambiguous. And so the model very often would actually predict the same individual, let's say, twice. And so the top-down approach is usually the more accurate approach than the other approach I will tell you about in a second. But it but it becomes it's less accurate in crowded scenes when people are really close to each other. So the alternative approach to bottom up to the top down approach is the so-called bottom up approach. So here you essentially have two steps again, but only one involves a neural network typically. And so the first part is you localize all the body parts simultaneously, and including their semantic nature. So you would know, okay, this is the shoulder, and so on and so forth. And then you may also estimate some features that help you to group how the body parts belong to each other. Okay, so which body parts form one individual. So one typical approach, for example, done in OpenPose, a very famous algorithm, is to predict limbs or vector fields between key points of a given individual. And then those vector fields are used to calculate costs of affinities, and those affinities are then used to assemble individuals. Okay. This approach works much better than top-down in crowded scenes, but it also often has problems because you kind of, when you do the grouping, you no longer take visual information into account. You just do it based on some estimated properties, let's say affinities or costs. And so, so the performance is also not that good often in crowded scenes. So recently we came up with an approach that I would say is roughly inspired by human vision, and that combines those two approaches. And we call it bottom-up conditioned top-down approaches, or in short, BACTD. And so here the idea is to actually use a bottom-up model instead of a detector as the first step. So you don't just get you don't just get a bounding box, but you in fact get key point predictions for each individual, which even if the individuals are very close to each other, you can usually get at least a few key points that are different for the two individuals, in a case where, let's say, a detector would actually give you very similar bounding boxes. And in that way, we don't have this ambiguity problem for the next stage. And so what we then do is we also generalize top-down pose estimation models to so-called conditioned top-down models, where we give the model a crop, so a bounding box and person inside, or multiple people inside. And we also give it a cue on which individual the algorithm should focus on. So we condition it on, let's say, the orange or the blue individual in this case. And so what this second model then actually does is it can do some kind of error correction to predict the correct individual. And so I'm saying this is inspired by human vision because in human vision, we don't just have, let's say, bottom-up processing, but of course, how we process visual stimuli is also influenced by our expectations of the world. So we have some pattern, or we're looking for something specific. And so the idea here is that, let's say, the BU detector does one bottom-up processing step, and then based on that, you select which individual you're interested in and do pose estimation on that. And that's kind of the idea of BACTD. We, in the paper, show various different ways in which you can implement BACTD. You can integrate it with CNNs, you can integrate it with various transformers, and we reach extremely strong performance. So here to the right, you see benchmarks on two different benchmarks. One is an animal benchmark with the marmosets that I showed you earlier. Here, the yellow line was our previous state of the art from the Nature Methods paper, and the red line is what we could do. We could really substantially improve the performance. And on a human benchmark called CrowdPose, which is 2D pose estimation for crowded humans, as you can imagine. So here's some typical examples from this benchmark. You can also see that our approach improves substantially over previous methods. Yeah. And here's an example of BACTD on a video of people doing dancing. Oh, I don't know what that is, honestly. Great. So in closing of that sections, so DeepLabCut isn't just pose estimation models that you can use, but it actually is a whole software pipeline that comes with graphical user interfaces and project management and stores your annotation data so that you can create targeted deep neural network models that can deal with your data and you can train your specific model for your data. And I should also say that we have a model zoo that contains a lot of pre-trained models. For example, we have one model that can do multiple quadrupeds from the side in a zero-shot fashion, or we have a model that can do mice seen from above in a zero-shot fashion quite well. And again, kind of as a summary, because these deep learning models don't actually have a body model, you can really adapt them very easily to many different scenarios. And you can use DeepLabCut, let's say, in cell tracking, tissue tracking, and of course, tracking of whole organisms, either in groups or individuals. And the code has now been downloaded more than 600,000 times. And there's really a lot of people also that contribute to the code base. And it has been a very exciting journey. So with that, I'm done with DeepLabCut. And I want to highlight one very recent paper that I'm extremely excited about that is called Amadeus GPT. As you all are aware, GPT is quite an exciting large language model that opens up many new avenues. And one thing that we actually developed is a system called Amadeus GPT that gives people a natural language interface to use behavioral analysis tools. And that was published last year in NeurIPS. And so here would be, in the interest of time, I just want to highlight one particular use case. So imagine you have a video of a mouse that is in some arena, and you're interested in knowing when is the mouse on the treadmill. So you would literally just type, when is the mouse on the treadmill? And so what Amadeus GPT does is it takes that prompt and it has in context learned how to use various behavioral tools. For example, DeepLabCut, but also SAM from Meta, which is a segment anything model. And so based on this prompt, it will realize, okay, probably there's a mouse in here in your video. So let me take the top view mouse model of DeepLabCut and analyze the video. So it will automatically do that. It will segment all the objects in the arena. It will ask you, well, which of these objects is actually the treadmill? You will say 18. And then based on that, it will tell you, well, the result of your query is in 12,836 frames. The mouse is on the treadmill and the video is so and so long. And then you can ask it to make plots of this and so on. What is, I think, quite exciting about this framework is it doesn't just do this analysis for you, but it also gives you Python code that you can then use on other videos, and that helps you, to scale up your analysis and also verify whether Amadeus GPT actually writes the correct code for you. Yeah. So with that, I want to switch gears and talk about reverse engineering the sensorimotor system and how we're interested in this in the lab. Of course, as you know, the brain is extremely complicated structure. And one way that we want to kind of model the brain is to come up with caricatures of various parts of the brain that we want to model. And we want to kind of reverse engineer these caricatures that you see here on the right by constraining them on behaving, let's say, in the same way as an animal does or a particular human does. And as you can see, especially for motor skills, that's where, of course, pose estimation is a really interesting tool, because we can use pose estimation to quantify animal behavior and then constrain models to actually carry out that behavior and then look inside those models and see if they actually do things similarly to the brain, okay? And so I want to talk specifically about modeling what is called the proprioceptive pathway of a mammal. And so the proprioceptive pathway, I don't know if you guys are very familiar with this, so proprioception is one of our senses, and it's the sense that that deals with estimating the state of your body, if you want. And the way this actually is carried out in our body is we have sensory neurons that are distributed in our body and that are actually distributed in our muscles, and they sense the length and velocity of our muscles at any time. And based on those sensors, somehow our brain comes up with a coherent representation of where our body is in space. Keep in mind that because the sensors are actually in the muscles, there's, for example, no sensor in my brain that in egocentric coordinate, or there's no sensor in my body that in egocentric coordinate knows where the tip of my finger is. But this is actually something that my brain has to compute. And so what we were interested in doing is we wanted to reverse engineer this proprioceptive system. And in order to do that, we wanted to create candidate models of the proprioceptive system, okay? And the idea that we had here is that we can use biomechanical models to simulate movement and simulate the putative input that the spinal cord would actually get if you are moving in this particular way. And then what we can do is we can look at the literature in proprioception, which is literature that goes way back, at least 150 years, where people have argued what the purpose of proprioception is. And we can take those hypotheses and kind of define them, formalize them as computational goals. And we can then take a particular encoder, so a neural network that would process the putative spinal cord input and is trained to carry out that particular computational objective. And we can then ask which of those objectives creates a neural network here that best mimics how the neural code of the proprioceptive system in a primate is actually at different stages. So that's the basic kind of plan. And what I will now do is I will show you which 16 computational hypotheses we actually looked at. I will show you some of the neural data that we use to kind of test our models. And then I will show you how our models look and how well they can predict the neural data in a monkey doing certain tasks. So here are the 16 computational goals that we implemented. To the left, there are a number of different tasks whose goal it really is, well, computationally speaking, they're really regression tasks, where we would posit that what the proprioceptive system is actually doing is it takes the spindle information and it tries to come up with it tries to localize where the body parts are, or localize and estimate the velocity of where body parts are, or estimate the velocity and the acceleration of how body parts are moving. So these are hand position, hand velocity, hand position and velocity, and acceleration. And then, of course, you could imagine that the proprioceptive system does this actually in different coordinate systems. So it could operate in egocentric coordinates, or it could operate in joint coordinates. So these are some of these supervised tasks we look at. Another hypothesis you could have is, well, actually, proprioception is more interested in helping you to control your arm. And it actually estimates the state of your body in order to move your body. That would be the sensorimotor hypothesis, where what the task of the encoder actually is to process the spindle information in order to predict torques in order to reach arbitrary targets. And then we had another hypothesis, which is called the action recognition hypothesis, where we say, well, actually, the proprioceptive system is not interested in localizing the body, but more in understanding what you are doing, okay? So if I do this, let's say I'm making a circular movement, and I can do that movement over here, and maybe my proprioceptive system would actually like to understand those things. And then finally, there are two unsupervised tasks that we looked at. And these are really inspired by very classic thinking of any sensory system. And they go back to a person called Horace Barlow, who argued that the goal of any sensory system is actually to remove redundancies in the input. Because, for example, from the eyeball to your visual areas, there's actually an optic nerve. And due to resource limitations, you want to compress information as much as possible. So we do something similar. We actually train models to reduce redundancy in the encoder, and we could then test those, or we trained model as a kind of autoencoder where you have to do something similar due to the bottleneck. So these are our 16 computational goals. And notice that we are not training our encoders on the particular task that a monkey is doing, whose data we want to explain. So we are really interested in seeing which computational goal learns a representation or learns a processing pathway that is more aligned to a monkey doing particular tasks, okay? So it's really a generalization test. And so the particular task that we modeled was a monkey doing a so-called center outreach task. So the monkey is using kind of a little robotic arm, and it's cued to move to certain positions. In fact, 8 different target directions. Okay, so they're colored in different colors. And there's actually an active case and a passive case. So in the active case, the monkey is cued and just reaches to one of the targets. In the passive case, in an unpredictable way for the monkey, there's a little bump that is happening to its arm, and it's moved passively. So now what they also did is they actually used DeepLabCut. So this is data from Lee Miller's lab at Northwestern. And they did 3D pose estimation of the arm. And we can then do inverse dynamics to estimate the state of all the muscles in the arm of the monkey. And that is really good for us because that way we can feed in the estimated proprioceptive input to our models, okay? So just to give you an idea of how complex the data is of the neural dynamics in the brain, here is actually the data from one neuron in the brainstem of the monkey. So this is just 2 synapses away from the actual sensory receptors. And what you see is on the y-axis is the firing rate of particular neurons, and on the x-axis is time. And then underneath you can see a little arrow, and that arrow is actually the target direction to which the monkey was moving. And you can see that if the monkey moves in different directions, the dynamics looks actually quite different. And even if the monkey makes exactly the same movement to the same target, well, sorry, they don't make exactly the same movement. They might have slightly different posture, but overall the trajectory, goes to the same target. You can get neural dynamics that look quite different. So just consider these 2 neurons here, or these 2 trials. So these are different trials, same neuron. So this is the kind of data that we would like to explain, okay? So now let's have one big picture here. What we do is we create a large-scale synthetic data set based on a primate non-human arm. We train the same neural networks from the same initialization on many different computational tasks. We store the weights, we freeze the weights, and then we take the actual movement from the monkey during this experiment, and we feed it into our model and extract the representation at different stages of our model. And then what we want to do is we want to use those neural dynamics to predict the actual neural dynamics in the monkey brain, okay? And on the next slide, I'll show you some predictions of our model. These are obviously trials that we did not use to describe, to kind of fit how the latent dynamics are actually predicting neural data. So these are test trials. And so what you see here again in black, you already saw that data. That's the real neural dynamics of the primate. And in red is the predictions of our model. And we were quite pleased with this because, as you can see, it can really capture the dynamics quite well. And even in trials where the monkey, let's say, goes in the same direction, but in clearly or putatively different, does it kind of biomechanically slightly different, our model can actually capture the differences in this firing, okay? And so here, what we can do in order to quantify this is we can calculate the explained variance, which for this neuron, we would actually explain 62% of the explained variance. This is, of course, one of the best neurons that we have. And what we can do is we also typically record multiple neurons in parallel in the brain. And so what we can now do is we can average for all those parallelly recorded neurons and get one explained variance. And on the next slide, I want to highlight one of the key results of our paper, which is the following. On the y-axis is the explained variance of our models for explaining the neural data. And the different colors are actually different primates. Yeah. And each dot is a different neural network, okay? And so on the x-axis, what we have is how good can this neural network solve the synthetic data task? Here, the synthetic data task is actually predicting the position and the velocity of the hand. And on the y-axis, again, is then how well does this neural network generalize to predict the neural dynamics of the monkey. What I think is really exciting here is that for all the monkeys, we actually get a correlation. So in other words, the better our model is at solving a synthetic task of the proprioceptive system, the better they actually generalize to explain the neural data of the primate, okay? Which I think is a good normative justification of this approach. Of course, what we haven't answered right now or so far is the question of which task is actually the best one at explaining the neural dynamics. And so what we did here is we compared all 16 tasks. And what I should say before I dig into this is that even I was kind of alluding to this earlier, that we actually trained the same encoders from the same random initialization on all the 16 tasks. And so we can always compare a trained model for a particular architecture to its initialization. It turns out even a random, like the initialization itself, can be particularly good or particularly bad at explaining the neural data. That makes sense because it's kind of like a nonlinear feature extractor. And what we therefore do is we subtract the explained variance once the model is trained. Well, from the explained variance once the model is trained, we subtract the explained variance of the untrained instance. And then we compare the different tasks. So if we cluster the data in this way, then we end up with a plot like this, where we have 5 different clusters. And here, again, this is kind of the difference between trained and untrained explained variance z-scored. So there's some models that are as good as untrained models because, yeah, so they're basically random. As good as random models, then there's some tasks that are actually worse than taking a random neural network. And then there are a bunch of tasks that are better. Now, of course, the key question is which task is which. And so here I now label the particular tasks. And what we found is that, that actually the best tasks were predicting the position and the velocity of the arm. And what is really interesting is that it doesn't matter in which coordinate framework you do this. So we have 3 different coordinate frameworks. If we either do it egocentric or in joint angles, or if we do it egocentric, including other joint degrees of freedom, we end up with an equally good representation at predicting this. And then, for example, a task where we only predict the position or the velocities are worse than predicting both tasks simultaneously. And then the autoencoder, for example, or torque prediction is as good as random. And then there are a bunch of tasks that are even worse than random. For example, if we do redundancy reduction, which you could argue is something that the brain might want to do because the spinal cord is actually a bottleneck, we end up with worse representations than if we randomly initialize our encoder, okay? Statistically speaking. So bottom lines for this part is task-driven models beat data-driven and linear models from muscles when explaining neural dynamics. The task performance correlates with the neural explainability, and the task of state estimation best explains QNet nucleus and S1 during the active trials. I didn't talk about the other 2, so let's actually skip that part. What is nice about this result about state estimation being the best task is that in some sense, if you would open a textbook, it will tell you the goal of the proprioceptive system is to know where your body is in space. Well, we find that computationally, if you train models in this way, that's also what we find essentially. So when I started this section, I was telling you that we're really interested in reverse engineering the sensorimotor system. But as you probably noticed, I was only talking about proprioception, which is the sensory part of sensorimotor, but we didn't optimize the full sensorimotor system. And in the interest of time, yes?
Can I ask a question on the previous slide?
Yes.
There. You had, the slide before that, on the results there.
Yes.
So you had HB and HV, that's a good combination on the top right. But if you add HA, the hand acceleration, you go to the very worst cluster.
That's right.
Can you explain that in some way?
Yeah, it's a great question. You notice that it quite well. And it is indeed a surprising result a priori, because let's say in multitask training, if you train a neural network on more tasks, you would expect that the representation is actually better if it has to solve more things at doing something. Of course, only under the assumption that the model can actually do all three tasks really well. So one thing, if you train it on also predicting acceleration, the performance for predicting the pose and the velocity actually decays. So the model is worse at doing that. And and another point that we realized then is essentially, well, predicting acceleration is really hard, because it's the fastest signal, if you want, of position and velocity otherwise. And in particular, the way we model the spindles in this work is we model stretch and velocity. And there's actually another type of receptors in the body that can do acceleration or force estimation. And we didn't include that kind of receptor at that time. So one of the reasons is that actually predicting acceleration from just position and velocity stretch is extremely hard, and the models cannot really do it. That said, if you do look at the neural dynamics itself, it is also not particularly correlated to acceleration, actually. So that's another reason why I think we find that result. Maybe a bit of the answer. Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah. So so one thing we're really interested now is to jointly optimize the motor system and the sensory motor system, as it's suggested in this picture. I have actually another paper that I wanted to show, but probably don't have time to dig into it in too much detail. But essentially, that's something that people very naturally do in reinforcement learning. So if we take a state-of-the-art reinforcement learning like SAC, you can train it with a few hundred or a few million interactions in a physics engine to, for example, move an ant or a hopper or a walker. This is actually a state-of-the-art algorithm. And typically, the way these algorithms work is during the rollouts. So during your rollouts, you will actually add isotropic exploratory noise. And that is then used to evaluate your performance, calculate some updates, and then you update your policy network. Okay. What we argue in a paper that came out last year in NeurIPS is that is not a good idea if the plant is, or if the body you're controlling is very high dimensional. And in particular for musculoskeletal systems, that's not a good idea. The reason is, imagine, let's say, with an arm, you have various agonists and antagonist muscles, and you may not want to inject random noise into agonists and antagonists because they might just cancel each other out quite often. And so one idea would be that you would like to have exploratory-driven noise that is structured in actuator space. And one way you could do this is, unlike in normal kind of reinforcement learning where you add IID noise at the output layer, you could inject IID noise at the penultimate layer. And if you're actually doing this, you exploit the structure of the penultimate weights, and they might have some understanding of what is an antagonist and an agonist muscle, and therefore you would maybe drive exploration in a better way. And I'm telling you this because it turns out to be true. So if you see lattice here, then especially if you control a high-dimensional body like the humanoid, with lattice, which is our method where we inject noise in this way, we actually beat SAC or other state-of-the-art algorithms by a factor of almost 2. Notice that for these morphologies where the degrees of freedom are relatively small, there's actually no difference between our method and previous state-of-the-art. And that is intuitively also clear because if you have very few actuator dimensions, then exploiting correlation structure is not that useful because actually these algorithms are good at exploring as such, okay, if it's simple enough. Now, the difference between our algorithm and other algorithms becomes even more apparent when we do musculoskeletal control. So here the task is, you will see it in a second, in this video, the task is to rotate the cube to a particular target rotation. Once you achieve it, it becomes green. And the body you are controlling here is a musculoskeletal human arm with 39 degrees of freedom. So that's a lot of degrees of freedom. This is early in training of our algorithm. This is here late in training. So you can see that Lattice can do this pretty well. And there are also other object manipulation tasks that we looked at, like rotating a pen, very common during talks. I hope many of you were doing that. And what we find in the paper and report in the paper, that especially for object manipulation tasks, Lattice can beat. Here we use PPO because it's actually better than SAC on these types of environments by quite a good number. And one thing that what was also quite interesting was that Lattice arrives at solutions or at controllers that actually are more energy efficient, which probably is really related to the fact that, let's say, Lattice doesn't use counteracting muscles at the same time, which is, of course, just costly for the amount of energy you need to expend. I should also say, if you look at the performance of even Lattice, for example, for the bowling ball task, we only reach 45% accuracy, meaning only in 45% of the cases we can actually do it correctly. And let's say with PPO, we were around 35% before. So we are not really reaching 100% accuracy. And that's also something that we work on quite actively. And there have been 2 NeurIPS challenges in the last 2 years where we won both of them. And where we included in our RL approach is also curriculum learning, which I think is quite essential, or seemingly it's quite essential for learning a motor skill with very high accuracy. So here, for example, bowling ball, we could solve with 100% accuracy, at least for this particular target, by using curriculum learning strategies that are inspired by human skill learning. So with this, I'm at the end of my talk. So take-home messages, just very briefly, if you can see it, DeepLabCut can track it. All the code is open source. You feel free to play around. I was talking about our work on reverse engineering proprioception and also inductive biases. And in particular, there I showed that Lattice is a good way to kind of learn policies when you deal with a lot of degrees of freedom. And then I want to thank, obviously, my lab and our funders, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Alexander. So let's bring out the questions.
Yeah, there's a question from, or I guess you, sorry.
Oh, yeah. In the chat from Anastasia. What is that tool? Mayo Hub, Mayo Suite?
Yeah, right. So this is the Mayo Suite. So the Mayo challenge that was run twice now is built in the Mayo Suite, and it's a tool that was initially developed within Meta, but now is an open source project, and it's a really exciting project. Essentially, what is happening there is people ported open sim models, which is in biomechanics the more common kind of tool, to something that is built on top of Mujoko. And the huge advantage is it's extremely fast. And especially if you want to learn skills with reinforcement learning where you need to interact with the simulator a lot of times, then you want a really fast simulator. And this is the simulator, yeah.
Great. More questions? You can just unmute yourselves. In the lattice results, there seem to be the score seems to be jumping a bit in your plots.
Yeah.
Do you have some reflections on that?
I mean, it's typical in continuous control to have learning curves like that. Even where sometimes, yeah, you get like even a weird drop in performance for a while. I think it's the instability of the learning algorithms essentially, and there's still a lot of work we need to do to improve continuous reinforcement learning. Maybe that's the brief answer I will give. Yeah. But maybe like to give a better intuition, one of the reasons is that when you do the rollouts and you calculate the updates you want to do to your policy, you may not do purposefully as many rollouts because otherwise it's just extremely costly for then calculating the update. And therefore, that means the sample you're calculating your updates on is also not maybe the most reliable sample. And so you can get quite some fluctuation because of that.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
Yeah, this your presentation reminds me of some work that has been done on synergies between degrees of freedom. I wonder, have you considered that? And it seems that your methods may be applicable to quite complex movements if you take that into account.
Yeah, so that's right. So is in computational neuroscience, there has been a lot of work on muscle synergies. And of course, in neuroscience, we believe that muscle synergies is maybe, in fact, something that is used to learn control policies and that the brain kind of uses as a trick to solve this problem of controlling many degrees of freedom, essentially. So yeah, lattice is in some sense a very simple idea now where we just wanted to adapt continuous control, like state-of-the-art algorithms, and argue that by doing kind of latent driven exploration, we can boost the performance. An alternative would indeed be, as you're saying, to, for example, instead of directly outputting actions, you would actually output, let's say, control signals that then controls syllables or specific synergies. There has been recently actually some work also using MyoSuite that did this, and they reached quite good results. And especially for multitask learning, that's something that is quite interesting. So, yeah. We do have, by the way, evidence in the paper itself that that the model is maybe geared towards more like developing more robust synergies and actually more like, yeah, using the degrees of freedom, like the control policy actually ends up with more compact degrees of freedom for doing the task. Yeah. I can also maybe very briefly advertise in particular this paper here. We analyzed our winning solution for the bowling ball task. So this is just done by our archive. And we calculated the degrees of freedom that our policy actually arrives at. And there has been data where people estimated in bowling balls in humans, the degrees of freedom that a human uses. And it's actually extremely similar what the model learns and what people actually use, which is around 5 degrees of freedom, 6. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. But
Okay.
this,
Yeah.
I could have a question on the firing rate that you had on the monkey brain here, and that is spikes per bin. But your model, is that spiking as well, or is it activation levels? Or
yeah, so we are not directly predicting spikes in the primate brain. We actually predict smoothed firing rates, if you want. So here we use a Gaussian kernel and we move it over the spike train of the monkey. And that's what you see here actually. So this black trace is the estimated firing rate. And then the model indeed is also a rate-based model. And we fit from that to that. Yeah. But it's of course a very interesting direction to, let's say, model that as a spiking neural network, or directly predicting the spikes. Yeah.
But it's quite time consuming as for simulating that. So
right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this is a nice segue into my introduction of the talk next, the next Learning Machines seminar, which is on March 7th, when we'll have Elise van der Poel from Microsoft Research, and she'll talk about symmetry and structure in deep reinforcement learning. So welcome back on March 7th, and thank you very much, Alexander Mathis, for this interesting talk.
Thanks for having me. And if anyone has questions, feel free to email me. Bye.
Bye-bye.